Good morning. I'd like to begin by saying it's a great honor and a real privilege for me to be here back at Quinnipiac, and I'd like to begin by thanking Christine, Charity, Sarah, everybody in the library for organizing this wonderful conference and organizing the wonderful exhibit that we're going to go see after my talk. The title of my lecture today is Sacred and Sacrilegious Women's Testimonials, the Grey Nuns and Maria Monk, Famine Irish Migrants, and the Montreal Fever Sheds in 1847-1848. I would also like to reiterate Christine's welcome to the two Grey Nuns we have with us, and perhaps apologize in advance for the fact that I'll be dwelling perhaps a little bit more than I should on the sacrilegious, more than the sacred at the beginning of my talk. My talk is intended, of course, to provide an introduction and an overview to the Saving the Famine Irish exhibit that Christine and I have curated and that we're going to be seeing shortly. As stated in the exhibit brochure, during one of the bleakest years of the famine in Ireland in 1847, an estimated 100,000 Irish people fled on coffin ships to Canada. The most detailed, evocative eyewitness accounts of their suffering can be found in the French language annals and archival records of the Grey Nuns, or Sisters of Charity, who cared for them in the fever sheds of Montreal. Approximately 6,000 Irish emigrants perished there, mainly from typhus and infectious disease. The exhibition tells their story from the perspective of those who cared for them, mainly the Grey Nuns. And during my lecture, I certainly want to provide, as I said, an overview of the exhibit and to emphasize some of its most compelling artifacts and archival records. But I also want to develop an argument about the sacred and sacrilegious female religious testimonials contained within the exhibit, and to situate them in relation to some of the broader conference themes. More specifically, I want to examine the changing registers in these female religious testimonials between the sacrilegious and the sacred within a broader discourse that James Smith has defined as the architecture of containment. In his groundbreaking study entitled Ireland's Magdalen Laundries and the Nation's Architecture of Containment, James Smith contends that, quote, in its concrete form, Ireland's architecture of containment encompassed an assortment of institutions, including mother and baby homes, industrial and reformatory schools, mental asylums, adoption agencies, and Magdalen laundries. These institutions concealed citizens already marginalized by a number of interrelated social phenomena: poverty, illegitimacy, sexual abuse, infanticide. Although Smith's study focuses on 20th century Ireland, the discourse of containment he explores has its origins partly in 19th century North America, and especially in the controversy surrounding Maria Monk that erupted in 1836, precisely around accusations of the institutional concealment of female and child victims of illegitimacy, sexual abuse, and infanticide. Indeed, at the heart of the Maria Monk controversy and discourse of containment is a sense of public fascination and repulsion with the concealed women and children incarcerated in these institutions and their propensity to develop lurid fantasies about them. The main argument I want to develop is that the sacred images and religious iconography of the French, Canadian, and Irish female religious caring for famine emigrants in 1847 that we are going to see in the Saving the Famine Irish exhibit were directly influenced and shaped by the sinister impressions of Maria Monk a decade earlier, which they sought to repudiate and replace. In fact, this tension between the sacred and sacrilegious, or iconic and idolatrous images of women, is evident in the title of the Saving the Famine Irish exhibit, which alludes both to the physical salvation of Irish emigrants in Montreal's fever sheds, but also to the struggle for their souls. As we shall see, this tension was embodied in the vilified and venerated figures of the uncloistered nun with the Irish child, which provides a focal point for the popular memory of both Maria Monk as well as the fever sheds. As we will also see, the convents and the fever sheds were situated in close proximity to one another, and I want to briefly demonstrate how close they were by pointing out where they are on this map. So, if you look at the bottom corner of the map here on the left-hand side, this is where the fever sheds were located towards the end of the summer of 1847. Earlier during the summer, they were actually up here at the corner of Wellington Street and Willishing Canal, literally on the outskirts of the city. Up here, you have the Grey Nunnery in 1847, and a little bit further to the east, you have the convent of the Sisters of St. Joseph, the convent Maria Monk claimed she was incarcerated in. It was about a 20-minute walk from the Grey Nunnery over here to the first site of the fever sheds in 1847. Very, very closely situated. Now, the story of Maria Monk is of a vulnerable young woman masquerading as an uncloistered nun who had escaped from her convent, yet who was in reality a former inmate of Montreal's Magdalen Asylum. Her attempt to expose the salacious details of life inside Montreal's Hotel Dieu, or St. Joseph Convent, was utterly sensational. Yet according to an affidavit from the matron of the Magdalen Asylum in 1836, quote, Maria has for many years led the life of a stroller and a prostitute, and she found her to be very uncertain and grossly deceitful. The question of whether Maria Monk had fled from a respectable convent or a disreputable Magdalen Asylum was at the heart of the controversy and veracity of her tale. As we will see, her book, entitled The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, or The Hidden Secrets of a Nun's Life in a Convent Exposed, published in 1836, did not simply cast aspersions on Montreal's clergy and female religious, whom she claimed had imprisoned her in the Hotel Dieu convent. Much more than that, Maria Monk specifically implicated and named in 1836 the very same French-Canadian and Irish priests and nuns who later cared for Irish famine migrants in the fever sheds of Montreal in 1847, including Montreal's parish priest and later bishop, Patrick Phelan, whom she alleged had impregnated her. Indeed, the very same individual priests and nuns who are celebrated and commemorated in the Saving the Famine Irish exhibit for their salvation of typhus-stricken Irish emigrants were figures of infamy a decade earlier when they were accused by Maria Monk of violating the sanctity of the convent's cloister, to engage in illicit sexual acts, and then to murder the offspring of their unholy unions. Ultimately, it was only by forgetting the sacrilegious figure of Maria Monk that the sacred memory of the clergy and female religious who cared for Irish emigrants in the sheds could be preserved and transmitted. Now today, The Awful Disclosures is probably best remembered as a quasi-pornographic text that Leopold Bloom peruses but does not purchase for his wife Molly in chapter 10 of James Joyce's Ulysses. Wandering Rocks, for those of you in the know. In the mid-19th century, however, Monk's purported autobiographical account of her experiences within and escape from the Hotel Dieu convent was a staple of American nativism and by all definitions a bestseller, with over 300,000 copies of her book purchased by 1860, second only to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in the antebellum United States, the second best-selling book in the US before 1860. As is common in Gothic fiction, The Awful Disclosures portrays the Hotel Dieu as a pseudo-brothel in which the priests and nuns engage in illicit acts and then smother their offspring, quote, infants born in the convent who are always baptized and immediately strangled. By definition, they are illegitimate children prescribed from birth in wedlock, the sacrilegious progeny of Catholic clergy and female religious who were betrothed to the Lord but have broken their sacred vows in acts of, quote, criminal intercourse. Moreover, they are ethnically marked in The Awful Disclosures as French-Canadian and Irish Catholics, their profane couplings giving rise to bastardized children that become living witnesses to clerical immorality. There's been surprisingly little analysis of The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, given its popularity, although its stigmatization of Catholicism has been interpreted in relation to the rise of Protestant nativism and the feminization of American culture. Some feminist readings of Maria Monk appear highly persuasive in their interpretation of the role of religious difference in the construction of American female subjectivity, but they do not fully consider its cultural context, in which Catholicism is stigmatized specifically in terms of French-Canadian and Irish alterity, as the epitome of the Protestant American other. The very cultural and ethnic distinctiveness of the convent's inhabitants accentuates it as a place of moral endangerment in the Protestant American imagination. As the embodiment of cultural and religious difference, the child conceived in the convent represents both the consequence of sexual impropriety as well as the reproduction of a seemingly inassimilable Catholic minority institutionalized in the heart of North American culture. Its very illegitimacy provides incontrovertible evidence of clerical iniquity and the extent of Catholic depravity, at least according to its proponents. As an uncloistered nun who broke her vows ostensibly to save her unborn child, Maria Monk became an object of both suspicion and veneration in the Protestant and Catholic press. Shortly after the publication of the awful disclosures in 1836, Maria Monk's claims were comprehensively refuted in John Jones and P.E. Leclerc's awful exposure of the atrocious plot formed by certain individuals against the clergy and nuns of Lower Canada through the intervention of Maria Monk, also published in 1836. In their awful exposure, it is alleged that Maria Monk was never a Hotel Dieu nun, but rather a prostitute whom, as I mentioned, gained her knowledge of the convent after a period of residence in Montreal's Magdalen Asylum, which scholars almost now universally agree is in fact the case. In the controversy that followed the publication of the awful disclosures, Maria Monk's credibility was repeatedly challenged on the basis of her knowledge of the interior of the convent, of which she had none, and the seeming extraordinary mobility she exhibited in not being confined to her cloister. According to the awful exposure, quote, "The nuns, novices, and postulants of the Hotel Dieu never leave the precincts of their convent for any purpose whatsoever. Their vows bind them to perpetual seclusion within the precincts of the hospital and convent. No nun is ever seen out of the convent. No nun would dare brave the exposure." In taking her vows, Maria Monk had sequestered herself in perpetuity behind the cloistered walls of the Hotel Dieu, and her very claims to have left the convent on occasion belied the veracity of her tale. By contrast, Maria Monk herself, in a sequel to her awful disclosures, contended that she only broke cloister to save her unborn child from certain death had she remained in the convent after giving birth. Hence, her act of breaking cloister is explicitly linked to her child's salvation in Maria Monk's account. Their mutual self-preservation necessitates her flight from the convent's perpetual seclusion. More significantly, her illegitimate child comes to embody the memory of clerical iniquity as living proof of what transpires behind convent walls. In response to the allegations that her initial disclosures were fraudulent, Maria Monk also names in her sequel the ostensible father of her infant, whom she contemplates confronting in Mass and, quote, calling upon the priest to own it. Hence, the cover illustration of Maria Monk's confirmations, which you see on the screen, features an image of the uncloistered nun with her child, an unholy Madonna, who was purportedly sired by the Kilkenny-born Father Patrick Phelan, Montreal's Irish Catholic parish priest. She specifically accuses him of seeking the child's extermination to dispose of the evidence of their unholy coupling. In her own words, quote, "Would a child destined to destruction, like the infants I had seen baptized and smothered, be allowed to go through the world unmolested, a living memorial of the truths of crimes practiced in security because never exposed? How could I trust the helpless infant in hands which had hastened the baptism of many such in order to hurry them to the secret pit in the cellar? Could I suppose that Father Patrick Phelan, priest of the parish church of Montreal, would see his own child growing up in the world and feel willing to run the risk of having the truth exposed? What could I expect, especially from him, but the utmost rancor and the most determined enmity against the innocent child and its abused and defenseless mother? Father Phelan's helpless infant is thus imagined to be a living memorial to the widespread profanity that occurs within the convent that ritualized acts of infanticide were intended to conceal. More importantly, in Breaking Cloister, Maria Monk confronts her abuser and makes public the desecration that ostensibly occurs within the convent to protect her child. As a living memorial of ecclesiastical and holy union, the infant is delivered by the uncloistered nun from certain destruction. In claiming to have been victimized by Father Patrick Phelan, Maria Monk also brought Montreal's Irish Catholic community into disrepute. In Montreal, however, the actual Father Phelan enjoyed the unlimited confidence of his congregation and was most renowned for his political conservatism. In fact, in the same year that he was accused of impregnating Maria Monk, Father Phelan exerted a restraining influence over his parishioners to prevent them from taking part in the 1837 rebellion in Lower Canada. If anything, Father Phelan was locally renowned for encouraging ethnic hostility rather than sexual promiscuity in Irish Catholics, whom he forbid from joining a French-Canadian insurgency. His reputation for political loyalty in Quebec contrasted markedly with his notoriety for licentiousness in the United States. His infamy abroad was offset by the fidelity of his parishioners that made Father Phelan a figurehead for Irish Catholics in Montreal. Yet both of them were implicated in Maria Monk's accusation that he sought to smother Irish children to protect his reputation. The sacrilegious image of the uncloistered nun with the Irish child in Maria Monk's awful disclosures thus became inverted and transfigured into the sacred memory of the nuns who broke their cloister to care for Irish infants in Montreal's fever sheds in 1847. As noted in the exhibit brochure, during the summer of 1847, the Grey Nuns were the first of 3 female religious orders that were summoned to care for the influx of Irish famine emigrants in the sheds. The only contemporary image of them is Théophile Hemel's painting, Le Typhus, completed in 1848, a reproduction of which is on display in the exhibition. The painting depicts the Grey Nuns, the Sisters of Providence, and then the Sisters of St. Joseph, or Maria Monk's ostensible order, alternatively tending to Irish typhus victims in succession during that summer. The Grey Nuns' Annals and Hemel's painting record the same story of female religious compassion, devotion, and self-sacrifice in alleviating the intense suffering of Irish famine migrants. They depict the heart-wrenching spectacle of the removal of Irish infants from the breast of their stricken mothers and little children only a few months old abandoned due to the death of their parents. In fact, the painting is iconic in the most profound sense of the term, not simply as a commemorative image, but also as a medium of intercession. It was commissioned by Montreal's Bishop Ignace Bourget at the height of the famine, we see him in the background of the painting, to depict, quote, the typhus seeking an entrance into the city, but checked at its gates by the Virgin Mary's powerful protection. The painting was subsequently installed in Montreal's Notre-Dame de Bonsecours Church and conveys the experiences recorded in the religious annals of the sisters who cared for Irish emigrants. In the foreground and middle ground of the painting, we see the nuns providing comfort, removing infants from the breast of their dying mothers, under the Virgin's protection, then against the backdrop of a fever shed. I believe this is the only actual image of a fever shed in Canada in 1847, as well as a panoramic view of the city. Le Typhus is also a history painting that visually recalls each of the 3 orders of nuns who did not in fact work together, but took it in turns to care for famine migrants. When we visit the Saving the Famine Irish exhibit later this morning, you will see a Grey Nun's habit on display that corresponds exactly with the one depicted in the foreground of the painting. Likewise, we see in the painting, in the third row of nuns, a habit from the Order of the Hotel Dieu, the Sisters of St. Joseph, that corresponds exactly with the habit worn by Maria Monk. The recurrent image in the painting, as I've noted, is that of the Irish infant being removed from its mother by each of these three orders of nuns, who became intermediary figures in the adoptions of these orphans from Irish into French-Canadian families. The painting corresponds very closely with the Annals of the Grey Nuns and many of the documents that are on display in the Saving the Famine Irish exhibit. These archival records contain the most detailed, extensive, and evocative accounts of Irish suffering in 1847, and they've been digitized, transcribed, and translated in a virtual archive hosted by NUI Galway. They comprise over 500 pages of first-hand testimonials about their experiences of caring for Irish emigrants, especially orphans and widows, in the sheds, and they remain still largely unknown to researchers and the public at large because they were unpublished and because they were written in French. The records attest to the Grey Nuns' compassion and self-sacrifice in caring for famine migrants, as well as fears of religious conversion during that summer. They also recount the bodily suffering and mass mortality of Irish fever victims. According to the Grey Nuns' Annals, and I quote, "Words are lacking to express the hideous state in which the sick found themselves, up to 3 of them in the same bed, or cots to be more exact, that had been hastily fashioned and gave the impression that they were caskets. When touring the sheds, we would find cadavers exhaling an insufferable infection, lying in the same bed as those that still breathed. The numbers of the sick was so considerable that we at some point counted 1,100 of them, some of whom had been dead for a few hours before we had noticed. One day a sister, passing one of the sheds, saw a poor afflicted that appeared restless. She came near his cot and saw that he was attempting to push off 2 dead bodies, between which he was lying down. In spite of the delirium that deprived him of some of his faculties, the sight of those cadavers, one black as coal, the other, in contrast, yellow like saffron, caused him such fright that it momentarily brought him back to his senses. Once delivered from his companions, he fell back into his previous state of insensibility, and the next day it was his turn to join the ranks of the dead. We could cite 1,000 traits of this kind, but it is impossible to report all of them." The Grey Nuns' Famine Annals also emphasize, as I've noted, the recurring sight of children being removed from their parents and being taken into the arms of the sisters. They recount, I quote, "What is even more heart-wrenching to see is little children, only a few months old, abandoned due to the death of their mothers. During these visits, we found more than one young child lying with mothers who no longer existed, suckling their breasts to find some nourishment. The priests, the nuns, linger in these scenes of desolation to temper the bitterness with words of peace and resignation. Sister Montgolfier, traversing the enclosure, met a little girl of 11 or 12 years old who was looking for her mother. She'd been transported to Montreal before her. The good sister took her affectionately by the hand and went with her from bedside to bedside. All anxious, the little ones looked left and right, her little heart beating with fear and hope. All of a sudden, she heard a most tender exclamation, 'Oh, mother!' But embracing her mother, her little arms held a moribund on her last breaths. Another morning, Sister Montgolfier was completing her usual visits when she noticed that young children had entered the enclosure where their dead father lay. These poor little ones were calling him, caressing him, and playing amongst themselves. Worried about the fatigue that this illness could cause, the vigilant sister hastened to take the young children back, but what pain! The father was but a cadaver. Such force did she need to take these children away. While hearing their heartbreaking cries, she guided them to the sheds designated for children, and a few days later she placed them happily with a family. These recollections of Irish families being torn asunder are also corroborated in contemporary press accounts and Théophile Hamel's painting, Le Typhus. What I want to emphasize is a small detail in the background of the painting. You see it in the top right-hand corner, which is corroborated both in the Annals of the Grey Nuns and press accounts, but it took me years to notice this. The painting is installed in the ceiling of Bon Secours Church in the entrance, which is quite poorly lit, and so you actually get a better view of it here on screen than if you go see the church itself. When you walk into the church, you have to crane your neck to look straight up, and it's very easy to miss the background details. It's only after I'd been there a number of times and had become familiar with the Annals of the Grey Nuns that I noticed in the background there, in the top right-hand corner, this spectacle of a husband cradling his dead wife. It's described in the Grey Nuns' Annals as follows. One day came a man from Groseille who had remained upon his arrival, being too sick to be transported to Montreal, where his wife, who was in good health, was sent with everyone else who had yet to be infected with the contagion. This poor man was looking everywhere for his wife without being able to find her. Finally, he enters the sheds and looks on every cot to no avail. He goes out to pursue his search. While he's crossing the courtyard, he sees a great number of dead bodies. He comes nearer to examine them more closely. What does he see? The inanimate body of his wife, for whom he was looking all of this time. He takes her in his arms, seeming to doubt that she is in fact dead. He wants to bring her back to life, talks to her, calls her by name, kisses her tenderly. But for all of these demonstrations, the only answer he receives is death's silence. Once he's convinced that she no longer exists, he abandons himself to his pain. The air is filled with cries and sobs. The spectacle was most heart-wrenching. Scenes of this nature occur several times a day. And indeed, the same spectacle was recorded more fleetingly in the Montreal Transcript newspaper on June 19th, 1847. Quote, "Many cases of extreme distress came to our knowledge during a recent visit to the sheds. We met with one poor heartbroken man whose children were in the hospital at Groseille and whose wife was uttering her last sighs in our sheds." It is these vignettes, these fleeting glimpses of families torn asunder, these individual catastrophes in which husbands, wives, parents, and children were irrevocably separated from one another, that have left their imprint on the memory of the Irish famine migration. But it is only when we are able to cross-reference between them, as in the spectacle of the grieving husband, that we can trace these iconic images to their historical moments of origin. Implicit within these images of Irish suffering and female religious compassion and devotion is also the anxiety of proselytization. It is important to emphasize that there were numerous Protestant, rather than exclusively Catholic, victims of the famine migration in Montreal. While there's limited evidence of actual religious conversions taking place within the fever sheds, the fear of them was intense. In the Grey Nuns' Annals, we see recorded, quote, "In seeing Protestant ministers circulating in the sheds, Sister Collins made a good guard against those that wished to indoctrinate." And then late in September of 1847, after the Grey Nuns had become ill, convalesced, and returned to the sheds, they established shed number 8 as a Catholic chapel, which generated quite a lasting controversy. More broadly, the Saving the Famine Irish exhibit contains traces of intense religious rivalries and anxieties about proselytization that surface in the Annals of the Grey Nuns when they recall their experiences of caring for Irish emigrants. Despite these heightened feelings and religious fears, however, the Grey Nuns also recorded remarkable stories of Irish resilience and survival. In their annal entitled Foundation of St. Patrick's Asylum in the Digital Famine Archive, they recount how an Irish widow named Suzanne Brown became separated from her youngest daughter Rose in Montreal's fever sheds after she had nearly succumbed to typhus, only to recover from her illness, having lost contact with her child. While convalescing under the care of the Grey Nuns, she helped to educate the orphans they had taken in. According to the Annal, quote, "When she found herself surrounded by the orphans who absorbed her teachings like thirsty earth absorbs the dew, she thought of her little Rose. If I had her here with me, she said, I would teach her with all the others. With this weighing on her mind, one March evening, she attended a Lenten prayer service or a benediction of the Holy Sacrament in St. Patrick's Church. In the silence of the ceremony, she was disturbed from her contemplation by the sound of a marble rolling on the floor, which came to rest in the folds of her clothes. She had barely raised her eyes when she saw a little girl aged 3 or 4 running to collect it. 'Is this not my little Rose?' she said, trembling with emotion. Indeed, it was this child, who she mourned and thought she had lost forever, now returned to her at this moment by our Lord, and by instinct she reached out. However, her adoptive mother, who had missed nothing of what happened, intervened and protested. Before the ceremony had even finished, both the women went to the sacristy to submit the case to Father Dowd, in fact, Father Phelan's successor. He did not delay in resolving the issue, and that very evening, Mrs. Brown triumphed, coming back to the refuge with little Rose. The reunification of Suzanne Brown with her daughter Rose attests to the broader role that the Grey Nuns played in caring for Irish emigrants and keeping families together. Thus, it is profoundly ironic that the very same priests and nuns who were vilified by Maria Monk in 1836 for plotting to murder helpless Irish infants became iconic figures and venerated in popular memory a decade later for their salvation of famine orphans. Indeed, the very same Father Patrick Phelan, whom she accused of scheming against their child, is recorded in the Annals of the Grey Nuns rescuing Irish children from the typhus epidemic. By 1847, he'd been promoted to the Bishop of Kingston, near Montreal, where he presided over the establishment of a second Hôtel Dieu convent in that city. During the famine influx, the nuns in both Hôtel Dieu convents in Montreal and Kingston were authorized by Bishop Patrick Phelan to, quote, break cloister and care for the sick. Indeed, the Annals of the Grey Nuns recall the, quote, saintly bishops, Patrick Phelan and Ignace Bourget, spent the entire night together on July 3rd, 1847, quote, tending to the poor victims of the epidemic. The accounts of Bishop Phelan's personal ministrations to Irish emigrants and his decision to release the Hôtel Dieu nuns from their seclusion to care for the sick obviously stand in marked contrast with Maria Monk's claims about him. They broke cloister at his behest to rescue rather than smother Irish infants. Moreover, the public fascination with the nuns who broke cloister was inextricably related to the discourse of the architecture of containment and concealment of ostensibly wayward women. The image of the uncloistered nun with the Irish child was gradually transformed from a living memorial of the truths of crimes of the clergy into an iconic motif of famine memory in both eyewitness accounts and subsequent reminiscences of the sufferings of Irish emigrants in 1847. The question of what really happened behind convent walls was stimulated by the Maria Monk controversy and then slowly elucidated and refuted in a pamphlet war and in documents like the Grey Nuns' archival records in display in the exhibit. One of the most remarkable of these records is a handwritten account of, quote, the rules to be observed by the emigrant widows and young women received in St. Anne's Asylum, established in 1847 to care for famine victims. These rules stipulated that the recently bereaved emigrant widows should lead a contemplative life, quite similar to a cloistered order of nuns, in which their appearance, daily periods of silence and frequent prayer, domestic chores, departures from the asylum, exchange of goods, meal times, receiving visitors, and sleep were all tightly regulated. Whether the young women in St. Anne's were consoled or disconcerted by their highly regimented existence, there can be no doubt about what transpired behind their asylum's walls. The observance of their rules could hardly fuel lurid fantasies about the containment and concealment of vulnerable young women that Maria Monk had purported to expose. There could be no awful disclosures of such a meticulously documented daily regimen. The emigrant widows and young women were not contained and concealed in the asylum, but rather encouraged to be mutually supportive and, quote, to endeavor to heal each other in a spirit of female fellowship. These privately held records could achieve little in themselves, however, to dispel the sinister impressions of Maria Monk. Much more important were the eyewitness accounts and subsequent testimonials about their heroic self-sacrifice and tender compassion exhibited by the Grey Nuns and female religious who cared for Irish famine emigrants in the sheds in 1847. The most significant of these eyewitness accounts was that of the Limerick-based Anglo-Irish landowner Stephen de Vere, whose letter to his uncle Lord Monteagle of Mount Trenchard became instrumental in improving conditions on emigrant ships and the single most influential and frequently quoted description of the famine voyage. His letter is also reproduced in the British Parliamentary Papers and is on display in the Saving the Famine Irish exhibit. It begins, quote, "Before the emigrant has been a week at sea, he is an altered man. How could it be otherwise? Hundreds of poor people, men, women, and children of all ages, from the driveling idiot of 90 to the babe just born, huddled together without light, without air, wallowing in filth and breathing a fetid atmosphere, sick in body, dispirited in heart." Despite Stephen de Vere's influence, however, the fact that he kept extensive, unpublished diaries and records of his famine voyage in 1847-48 to Canada remains almost completely unknown to scholars and the public at large. He kept a journal of his voyage to Canada, a detailed description of his arrival at Gros Isle, and then soon after his departure from Gros Isle, he traveled to Montreal, where he had a particularly formative experience. He noted in his journal on June 24th that, quote, "In Montreal, there was frightful mortality in the emigrant sheds, hospitals, and generally throughout the town." He was still in the city on July 3rd, 1847, when the Hotel Dieu nuns left their cloister to care for Irish migrants alongside Catholic clergy like Bishop Phelan. Since his departure from Ireland for Canada, Stephen de Vere had also converted to Catholicism, which he had been contemplating for many years, but only felt free to practice openly when he was away from his mother's influence. Quote, "Since I reached Canada, I've conformed to the ordinances of the Catholic Church," he wrote to his brother Vere on February 11th, 1848. Yet, the very first time that Stephen de Vere openly went to Catholic Mass on July 11th, 1847, in Montreal's newly consecrated St. Patrick's Church, which we see there, he beheld a sermon by none other than the very same Bishop Patrick Phelan, who Maria Monk had accused of impregnating her 11 years earlier, and who now, according to Stephen de Vere's journal, quote, "attributed the misfortunes of Ireland to the atrocious avarice of the landlords." As a compassionate, courageous, and progressive landowner who had contemplated converting to Catholicism for almost a decade, Stephen de Vere was perhaps unlucky to be inadvertently denounced from the altar on his very first occasion of public worship. Indeed, Bishop Phelan's sermon made such an impression on him that he cited it 6 months later in a letter to his brother, his younger brother, the poet Aubrey de Vere, on December 23rd, 1847, as evidence of Canadian sentiment. Quote, "The outcry against the Irish landlords here is furious. They are said to have produced all the miseries of Ireland, and by their heartless shoveling out of pauper emigrants to be now working the ruin of Canada. I've done all I can to stem the tide, but it is too strong. I've heard the evils of this year's emigration attributed in the pulpit to the atrocious avarice of the Irish landlords." It was Stephen de Vere's misfortune that the very first time he went to Catholic Mass, Bishop Phelan preached an angry sermon in which he felt implicated by his class. Bishop Phelan's sermon and the religious devotion he witnessed in the fever sheds profoundly affected Stephen de Vere after he returned to Ireland from Canada in 1848. In a lecture he delivered in Limerick several years later, he recalled that, quote, "The Catholic clergy attending the sheds and hospitals died in rapid succession, while their vacant places were filled by the nuns, of whom in Montreal alone, 48 were at one time prostrated by fever." He also disclaimed, quote, "the dangers he underwent during his own voyage to Canada as nothing when compared to those so fearlessly encountered by the clergy and by that noble army of martyrs, the nuns." More importantly, after his return to Ireland, de Vere explicitly contrasted his personal reminiscences of the nuns who tended to famine emigrants with the misrepresentations of Maria Monk. In a public address he gave in Limerick on April 17, 1854, de Vere rejected, quote, "the obscenities of Maria Monk, in which the doors and windows of the convent were said to be furnished with bars and chains to keep in the refractory nun. The very coal cellars were triumphantly pointed at as dungeons of the Inquisition upon a small scale." "I happened to be in Montreal during the year 1847, he declared, "that fearful year of pestilence, when thousands of our starved emigrants perished of ship's fever. A community of nuns offered their services. When they were sick or dead, a second community of nuns, not called upon by their rule to visit the sick, solicited permission to take their dying sisters' places. They obtained it, and they too were decimated." Stephen de Vere's personal reminiscences of clerical and female self-sacrifice were delivered to discredit the allegations of Maria Monk. The controversy surrounding the authenticity of her text was implicated within his own reminiscences of the famine Irish in Canada. Stephen de Vere's eyewitness testimonials thus helped to rehabilitate the Grey Nuns, Sisters of Providence, and Sisters of St. Joseph from the aspersions cast upon them by Maria Monk. They were further transformed from sacrilegious into sacred figures in the writings of other Irish authors who had borne witness to or heard first-hand accounts of Montreal's Irish famine influx, such as the founding editor of the Cork Examiner, John Francis Maguire, and the highly prolific and popular novelist Marianne Sadlier, whom we've already heard about in a number of papers at this conference. As I noted in my chapter in the Irish Hunger and Migration volume we launched a couple of nights ago, John Francis Maguire's book, The Irish in America, published in 1868, was based in part on his travels to Quebec City and Montreal in 1866, where he gained access to the Annals of the Grey Nuns and collected stories from famine emigrants at the moment when their recollections were passing from living into received memory. His book, The Irish in America, provided the key conduit for the transmission of famine remembrance between Ireland and Quebec, in which the French-Canadian adoption of Irish orphans and the retention of their surnames became the predominant motif and supplanted the more scurrilous allegations of Maria Monk. Maguire also described in detail Théophile Hamel's painting Le Typhus and the story of female religious compassion for famine emigrants it depicts. In his own words, quote, "First came the Grey Nuns, strong in love and faith. Then the Sisters of Providence came to their assistance and took their place by the side of the dying strangers. But when even their aid did not suffice to meet the emergency, the Hôtel Dieu Sisters of St. Joseph, though cloistered nuns, received the permission of the bishop to share with their sister religious the hardships and dangers of labor by day and by night." It is thus the image of the Hôtel Dieu nuns breaking their cloister to care for Irish emigrants that struck Maguire and other observers as what was most memorable about the fever sheds. He explicitly contrasted this memory with Maria Monk's awful disclosures, which he rejected as, quote, "an ingenious fraud upon public credulity." Her portrayal of, quote, "the Hôtel Dieu of Montreal as the scene of alleged iniquities which included child massacre scarcely less wholesale than Herod's slaughter of the innocents," Maguire dismissed as a monstrous lie. Like John Francis Maguire, the novelist Marianne Sadlier was also struck by the sight of the uncloistered nuns with the Irish child as the most memorable image of the sheds. Marianne Sadlier, as has been noted, was the most popular and prolific 19th century Irish novelist in North America. She wrote frequently about and for a famine Irish readership. She was the publisher with her husband of John Francis Maguire's The Irish in America, and she lived in Montreal in 1847, where she bore witness to the famine influx. Yet she did not write directly about what she saw in the city until nearly 5 decades after the event. When she finally did so in 1891, she recalled most fervently the spectacle of the nuns leaving their convent to go to the fever sheds to care for Irish emigrants, again as depicted in Hamel's painting. In Sadlier's own words, quote, "We have in Montreal a large picture of the interior of the fever sheds, showing with painful reality the rows of plague-stricken patients with the clergy and religious in attendance upon them. In the far background, the good bishop himself is seen in purple cassock ministering to the sick." Like Maguire, Sadlier describes the composition of the religious figures in the painting who arrived in succession to one another. She writes, quote, "First came the grey nuns, who gave themselves heart and soul to their fearful labours of the vast Lazar house. Then the Sisters of Providence took their place beside the coffin-like wooden beds of the fever patients in the sheds. When these two large communities were found to be inadequate to take care of the ever-increasing multitude of the sick, a thing came to pass which struck the whole city with admiration. The cloistered hospitallers of St. Joseph, the Hôtel Dieu nuns, whom the citizens of Montreal had never seen except behind the gratings of their chapel or parlor or in their own hospital wards, petitioned the bishop to dispense them their long vows of seclusion that they might go to the aid of their dear sister communities in the pestilential atmosphere of the sheds. The permission was freely given, and the strange sight was seen day by day in the streets of our ancient city of the close carriage that conveyed the sisters of the Hôtel Dieu from their quiet old-time convent to the Lazar house. People pointed it out to each other with solemn wonder, as the writer well remembers, and spoke with bated breath of the awful visitation that had brought the cloistered nuns from their convent in the outer world in obedience to the call of charity. Even after 5 decades, Marianne Sadlier vividly recalled the sight of these uncloistered nuns who went to the famine Irish in Montreal's fever sheds. I'll move now towards my conclusion. Like Stephen de Vere, like John Francis Maguire, Marianne Sadlier was ultimately transfixed by the spectacle of the uncloistered nun with the Irish child, which signified their rescue from the ravages of famine rather than Maria Monk's clerical ravishers. Ultimately, the remembrance of female religious compassion for Irish children in the fever sheds supplanted the more sinister impressions of Maria Monk, which were gradually forgotten. One of the most poignant documents we'll see in the Saving the Famine Irish exhibit is the category of orphans at Point St. Charles Register, which contains the names of the orphan children who were cared for by the Grey Nuns and then adopted by French, Canadian, and Irish families, 2 of whom were Patrick and Thomas Quinn, aged 12 and 6, from Strokestown in County Roscommon, from the Dennis Mahon estate, who were part of the cohort of 1,490 or perhaps 1,450 tenants who were emigrated that year, and whom, of course, Kieran Riley will be talking about later this afternoon. And the final point I want to make is that the story of the Grey Nuns and female religious that is told in the Saving the Famine Irish exhibit is a remarkable one that, as Christine Keneally notes, deserves to be better known. It is a story that in no way conforms to the awful disclosures of Maria Monk. The Grey Nun Annals and the Saving the Famine Irish exhibit do not reveal the containment and concealment of the Irish widows and orphans they cared for that James Smith associates with the Magdalen asylums from which Maria Monk's accusations had originated. On the contrary, they were encouraged to be mutually supportive and to endeavour to heal each other. Moreover, the exhibit and the digital Irish Famine Archive provide invaluable resources to help tell the Grey Nun story and commemorate those female religious orders that cared for Irish emigrants and the families who adopted famine orphans. Ireland's president, Michael D. Higgins, has paid tribute to them in a statement you can read in full in the exhibit brochure. There's also now a campaign to develop an Irish Famine Memorial Park on the site of the fever sheds in Montreal, which has been marked since 1859 by the black stone that was placed over a mass grave of famine victims discovered by the mainly Irish workers engaged in building the city's Victoria Bridge. Although the Black Rock is the first memorial to be erected to victims of the Great Hunger in North America, it is relatively inaccessible and unknown, located in the median of a major traffic artery, and most of the 6,000 Irish people who perished in the fever sheds now lie buried under the parking lot to the north of the monument. It is hoped that the Saving the Famine Irish exhibit will travel widely after it closes here at Quinnipiac next year, including to Montreal, where the Montreal Irish Monument Park Foundation hopes to host it and encourage the city to provide a more dignified resting place for the thousands of famine Irish who perished in the sheds, while commemorating the Grey Nuns and female religious who cared for the survivors. There could be no more fitting exhibit for this purpose. Thank you.